She was 20 years old, and she was sleeping in her car, which was a 2003 Vauxhall Astra with a cracked near-side wing mirror and enough room in the back seat for a sleeping bag if she angled her knees right. She had been doing this for 11 days. Before the car there had been her brother Joel's spare room in Bakewell, and before that there had been a rented flat in Sheffield that she'd lost when her landlord sold the building and gave the tenants 8 weeks and a shrug. She had asked Joel if she could stay while she found somewhere. He had said yes without quite meeting her eyes, which she understood to mean he had not asked his wife Claire yet. Claire had given Fen 2 weeks, which had become 3 weeks. And then on a Thursday evening, Claire had said, in the particular measured tone of someone who has decided that something is going to be said and has organized their thoughts in advance, that the arrangement had run its course, and that she hoped Fen understood. Fen had looked at Joel across the kitchen table. Joel had looked at his hands. He had not said anything, not a word in her direction, not a defense, not an apology. Not even the small acknowledgement of eye contact that would have told her he knew what was happening and was sorry for his part in it. He had simply sat there, looking at his hands, while his wife used careful words to end something that his silence had already ended. Fen had packed that night. She had stood outside on the pavement with her bags, and she had called Joel's mobile. It had rung 7 times and gone to voicemail, and she had not left a message because there was nothing to say into a voicemail that would be true and also useful, and she had got into the Astra and driven to a lay-by on the A6 and gone to sleep. 11 days later, she was parked outside the Derbyshire Dales District Council offices in Matlock, with a listing from the council's own asset disposal website, printed on a piece of paper she had used a library computer to find, and £10 in an envelope in her coat pocket. The listing was for a former Quarry office building on Intake Lane above the village of Stonelow, 4 miles west of Matlock. 2 rooms, a small outbuilding, half an acre of rough ground. Sold as seen. One condition: the building had a welded shut internal steel door that the council could not account for and had not been able to open, and the buyer took it as found. Asking price, £10. She put the £10 on the counter and got the key. If you're new here, I'd love for you to subscribe and leave a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I read every single one. Fenella Marsh had grown up in the Peaks, the daughter of parents who had separated when she was 9 and who had, in the efficient manner of 2 people who have decided the best thing to do with a shared life is to divide it cleanly and move on, arranged between themselves that Fen would live with her father in Tideswell and see her mother in school holidays. Her father was a quiet man, a joiner by trade, who died of a heart attack when Fen was 16, efficiently and without warning, in a way that left her and Joel, who was 8 years older and already living his own life in Bakewell, as the only family each other had. Joel had done his best. She knew this. He had sorted the house, arranged the finances, made sure she finished school. He had done these things with the competence of an older sibling who understands obligation and is not unkind, but who has also, in the years since, grown a life that has its own weight and its own center of gravity. And Fen had gradually come to understand that she existed at the edge of that center rather than within it. She had not resented this until the Thursday evening in the kitchen, and even then the resentment had arrived not as heat but as a cold, clarifying understanding. Joel had sat there and said nothing. She had watched him choose not to speak, and she had understood from the quality of that choosing that she had been further from the center than she'd known. She was not by nature someone who dwelt on things. She had her father's quality of turning toward the next task with the attention that the previous one was no longer going to receive. She had needed this quality in the 4 years since he died. She had finished her A-levels and done a year at agricultural college in Buxton, studying land management because the peaks were what she knew, and she thought she might as well know them formally. And then she had moved to Sheffield, because Sheffield had work, and work was what the situation required. She had waitressed and stocked shelves, and eventually found a job as an admin assistant at a land survey firm that valued her agricultural college knowledge, and paid her enough, barely, to rent a studio flat on Abbeydale Road. It had not been a large life, but it had been a stable one, and it had been hers. And losing the flat to a landlord's sale and the spare room to a brother's silence had not broken her as much as it might have broken someone who was less accustomed to rearranging what was available into something workable. She rearranged. She drove to Matlock. The next task was the Quarry office on Intake Lane, and she drove there with the key on the seat beside her and the limestone walls of the Derbyshire countryside rising on both sides of the lane, pale gray in the October light. The kind of landscape that does not soften its edges for anyone, but gives you its full geological honesty and expects you to find that sufficient. She had always thought it was sufficient. She thought so now more than ever. The quarry itself had closed in 1983. She knew this from the planning history she had pulled up at the library. The Stonalow limestone quarry had operated from 1891 to 1983, employing between 40 and 80 men at various points in its life, and the office building had served as the administrative center for all of it. Wages, records, blasting schedules, the ordinary bureaucracy of extracting limestone from a Derbyshire hillside for nearly a century. The quarry floor behind the building was still visible through the trees, a wide flat shelf cut into the hill, the exposed limestone pale as bone, with a particular melancholy of industrial land that has gone back to rough grass and scrub and has not quite decided whether it regrets or welcomes the change. After the closure, it had been used by the final quarry manager as a personal workshop until he died, at which point it had passed to the council on the usual accumulated rates and sat there for 6 years, waiting for someone to come in with £10. The building stood at the end of a track off Intake Lane, behind a dry stone wall that was losing its top course in several places, but was otherwise the solid, patient work of someone who had built it to last. The structure was 2 stories of limestone block, thicker walls than you'd get today, built when the material was free, because it was coming out of the ground 40 feet away. The ground floor was the main office, 2 rooms divided by a timber partition, the outer room with its original sash windows still glazed, the inner room with a workbench running the full length of the north wall and the tools still hanging on the board above it, each one outlined in marker pen the way you see in professional workshops, so you always know what is there and what is missing. Nothing was missing. Every outline had its tool. At the back of the inner room, in the corner where the limestone wall met the rear wall of the building, was the steel door. It was set into a stone archway that led, according to the old planning records, to the blasting room, the fireproof storage chamber where detonators and explosive records had been kept during the quarry's working life. The door itself was perhaps 3 inches of rolled steel, industrial weight, with a handle that had been there since the quarry days and which still turned but connected to nothing, because the door had been welded shut from the outside at some point after the quarry closed. The weld ran along the full frame in 3 sections, done carefully and in sequence, by someone who had wanted the door sealed and sealed to stay. She stood in front of it on the first afternoon with her hand on the cold steel, and she thought, whatever is in there, it has been in there in controlled conditions for a long time. The blasting room had been built to be fireproof and stable and sealed from temperature change, because those were the conditions that made explosives safe, and those same conditions made almost everything else safe too. She made a list. She was good at lists. The village of Stonalow was a 10-minute walk down Intake Lane, a limestone-built settlement of about 300 people with a pub, a post office, and a slightly cautious collective relationship with change that she recognized from growing up in Tideswell. The post office was run by a woman named Orla Finch, who was 61 and who had the compact, permanent attentiveness of someone who has operated the central information hub of a small community for long enough to know almost everything about almost everyone, and to have developed a precise and principled idea of what to do with that knowledge. She had watched Fenn park outside the Quarry office on the first morning and had been at the post office counter when Fenn came in for milk that afternoon, and she had said, without preamble, "You've taken on Walter's place." "Is that what they call it?" Fenn said. "That's what it is," Orla said. She put Fenn's milk in a bag. Walter Croft managed the Quarry for 35 years, went on using the office after it closed, said it was the right kind of quiet for thinking. She looked at Fenn with the assessing, unhurried attention she gave to most things. He was a good man. Fixed everything in this village that needed fixing. Clocks, mostly. Toward the end, he had a thing about clocks. But engines, kettles, radio sets, you name it. Never charged. Left a jar on the windowsill, and people put what they thought was fair. She paused. He died in 2017. Nobody came for the building. What happened to the clocks? Fenn asked. Orla looked at her for a moment. That, she said carefully, is a question I have wondered about for 6 years. The welding engineer came from Matlock on the second week. His name was Pete Sowerby, a man of 50 with the economical movements of someone who has been doing physical work for 3 decades and wastes nothing. He looked at the weld and said it was competent work, nothing fancy. The kind of thing a person does when they have a specific reason to want something shut and the means to do it properly. He said it would take him 2 hours with the angle grinder. He said he'd do it for £60, which was the last of what Fenn had left after a week of groceries and the first bag of coal for the range in the outer room, and she said yes. He ground the weld in 1 hour 40. He pulled the door open. The cold that came out was the cold of a sealed stone room in October. Still and clean. The cold of somewhere that has been keeping itself to itself for a long time. He shone his torch in and then stepped back and said, "Right then," in the tone of a man who has seen unexpected things in his professional life and has settled on understatement as the appropriate response. He collected his £60 and left. Fenn went in with her own torch. Every surface was covered. The blasting room was roughly 12 feet by 15, stone-walled, stone-floored, with timber shelving running the full perimeter from floor to ceiling. And on every shelf, on the floor between the shelves, on a long table that had been brought in and placed along the central axis of the room, were clocks. Bracket clocks, and mantel clocks, and wall clocks, and carriage clocks. A Vienna regulator in a glass-sided case. 2 anniversary clocks under glass domes filmed with dust. A cuckoo clock with its weights hanging still. And at the far end of the room, taking up the full wall height, a grandfather clock in a case of dark oak. Its pendulum stopped, its hands reading 20 past 4, the time at which it had last run. She counted later. There were 214 clocks. Every one had a paper tag tied to it with a length of thin cotton, written in a small upright hand. She picked up the nearest, a brass carriage clock with a white enamel face, and read its tag. Seth Thomas Carriage Clock, C1000 1910. Mrs. Patricia Henshaw, Chapel Lane, Stonelow brought in August 1991. Mainspring broken. Repaired. Not collected. She put it down carefully, where it had been. She picked up another, an Ormolu mantel clock, French C1000 1880, its gilded columns tarnished to brown but its face intact. Mr. and Mrs. Bryce, Intake Farm. Brought November 1986. Escapement damaged, repaired and regulated, not collected. She set it back. She moved along the shelves slowly, reading. Some tags were faded to near illegibility. The older ones, from the early 1980s, the ink browned and thin. Others were clear and recent. The most recent she found, dated 2013. All of them had the same final notation, either returned or not collected. Most said not collected. Some said returned, brought back, she understood, when the owners had moved away or died or simply changed their minds about wanting the thing. None of the tags said lost. None said gone. Every clock that had come into this room had been repaired, labeled, cataloged, and kept. Walter Croft had not thrown a single one away. He had simply kept them in the right conditions and waited for things to resolve themselves. Which, she thought, standing in the torchlight among 214 stopped clocks, is a form of faith that deserves a better name than stubbornness. She stood in the middle of the room in the torchlight, among the stopped clocks, and she thought about Walter Croft sitting in this room, or working in this room, she supposed, though sitting had a quality that seemed right, fixing clocks that people had forgotten or given up on, and keeping them for 30-odd years in a sealed stone room, in case. The grandfather clock was the last thing she went to. Its oak case was solid, heavy, the kind of furniture that does not acknowledge the passing of time in any register except the slow deepening of its own color, which was very dark. The face was painted, a moon phase dial above the chapter ring, the painting faded but intact. She opened the case door and looked at the pendulum. She looked at the movement. She crouched and opened the small door in the base of the case, where a winding key would normally be kept, and inside the compartment there was no key. There was a notebook, small, cloth-covered, held shut with an elastic band that had dried and snapped at some point, leaving the notebook slightly open. If you're still with me, please do subscribe if you haven't already. I'm glad you're here for this part. Walter Croft had been gone for 6 years, and what he had written in that notebook had been waiting in the base of a grandfather clock in a sealed room, and it was addressed, in his way, to whoever came after. She took the notebook to the workbench in the inner room, and she read it by the light of the work lamp she had run off the extension lead she'd brought from the car. Walter had written it in the last year of his life, 2016. It was not a letter exactly. It was more like a ledger, a final accounting. He had listed every clock that remained uncollected, the name on the tag, the address he'd had at the time, the year it came in, what he'd done to it. 209 entries, because 5 of the clocks had been collected in recent years by people who'd remembered. He had checked each one off. The remaining entries had a small mark beside them, a circle, nothing inside. Waiting. At the top of the first page, above the list, he had written, "Return them if you can. They belong to people." And at the bottom of the last page, below the final entry, in slightly larger letters, "Everything that stops can be started again. I have proved this. Do with it what you like." She sat with the notebook for a long time. Then she made another list. Orla Finch helped. She was the right person to help because she had 30 years of accumulated knowledge about who had lived where in Stoneleigh and the surrounding villages, and because she took the notebook without drama and read through it at the post office counter with the focused attention of someone doing a job they consider important. She identified 47 entries by memory, people she knew or had known, families she could trace. Graham Belshaw, who was a retired member of the British Horological Institute and who lived in Matlock, and who had been on the periphery of Orla's awareness for years as the person to call if you had a question about a clock, took the remaining entries and spent 3 weeks cross-referencing them against electoral rolls and local history records, and came back with traces on a further 61. Graham was a small, precise man of 68 who had spent his retirement doing exactly the kind of work this was: tracing, identifying, restoring the records of mechanical things and the people who had owned them, and who arrived at the Quarry office the first time with a magnifying glass and a notebook of his own, and spent 4 hours going through the blasting room with an expression of professional astonishment that he was clearly working to keep proportionate. He said the collection was remarkable. He said Walter Croft had been, on the evidence of the repair quality and the documentation, an exceptionally skilled amateur horologist. He said some of the clocks were of significant value, and he could help her understand which. He said all of this in the measured tone of someone who has learned that giving people too much information too quickly tends to make them nervous. They began the returns in November. Fen drove, because she had the car and Graham did not drive, and Orla came on the first day because she wanted to, and the three of them worked through the Stoneleigh entries first, which were the easiest. Most people answered the door with a look of complete blankness that became recognition, that became something harder to name. Not quite grief, not quite joy, but the particular emotion of being given back something you had stopped expecting. A woman named Mrs. Holloway on Chapel Lane received the Seth Thomas carriage clock that had been on the second shelf from the left in the blasting room since August 1991. She held it with the careful attentiveness of someone reconnecting a circuit that has been open for a long time, both hands around the case. The way you hold something you don't want to drop and also don't want to grip too tightly. She said her mother had brought it in, and that her mother had died in 1994, and that she had always assumed the clock had gone the same way as her mother's other things, sorted and dispersed, and that she had thought of it occasionally over the years, without knowing she was going to. She did not say anything else. She closed the door very gently, and Fen stood on the path for a moment in the November cold and thought about 33 years of assuming something is gone. The clock from the house fire was on page 7 of the notebook. The Barlow family, Raleigh Cottage, Great Hucklow. A bracket clock, English, C. 1890. Brought September 1987. Escapement worn, mainspring weak. Repaired and regulated. Not collected. Graham found a Susan Barlow living in Chapel on the Frith, the right age to be a daughter of the family. Orla wrote to her. The letter came back with a phone number and a message. Please call. Susan Barlow was 63. She told Fen, on the phone, that the clock had been her grandmother's and had been taken to Walter Croft for repair in the August of 1987 because the chime had gone wrong. And that in November of that year Raleigh Cottage had burned, and that her family had lost almost everything. And that the clock had been one of the things they had grieved among the other griefs, the particular grief of objects that had been in the family for generations and were simply gone. She had not known it had been at Walter's when the fire happened. She had not known it was safe. Fen drove to Chapel on the Frith on a Thursday morning with the bracket clock wrapped in a moving blanket on the back seat. Graham had serviced it the week before. Cleaned the movement, replaced the worn mainspring, regulated the escapement, and it was running cleanly now, its tick steady and even, audible through the blanket during the drive, in a way that seemed to her like something that had decided, at last, to announce itself. Susan Barlow came to the door in a gray cardigan and looked at the moving blanket, and then at Fen, and then at the blanket again. She did not speak. Fen unwrapped it on the doorstep because the door was not quite wide enough to bring the blanket through comfortably, and she thought Susan should see it in the light. The clock was mahogany cased. English, about 14 inches tall, with a white enamel face and a brass bezel, and the kind of plain, well-made quality of a thing built to be used for a lifetime, and then passed on. Its tick was clearly audible in the still November air. Susan Barlow put both hands on it before Fen had fully straightened. not taking it, just placing her hands on the case. The way you place your hands on something to confirm it is real. She stood like that for a moment. Then she looked up. It was on the mantelpiece, she said. When I was a child, every house we ever visited, I looked for the clock first, to see if it was like Grandma's. She looked down at the clock. None of them ever were. She did not go inside for some time. Fen stood on the pavement and did not fill the quiet with anything. Preet Dhaliwal wrote the story for the Matlock Mercury, a piece that ran to 12 paragraphs, and that was, Fen thought, very well done. It concentrated on Walter and the clocks and the families, and mentioned Fen only in the way you mention the person who opens a door, which was the right proportion. It was shared widely in the Peak District community groups on social media, and picked up briefly by a regional news website, and ended up in front of, among others, a mutual friend of Fen's and Joel's who shared it in a Peak District walking group with a comment about how remarkable people were. Joel saw it. He sent a WhatsApp message at 9:30 on a Friday evening. It said, "Saw the piece. Really good, Fen, hope you're well." She read it. She put the phone down. She went back to the clock she had been working on, which was a 19th century Vienna regulator that Graham had been teaching her to service, and which required a quality of attention that left no room for anything else. She did not reply. The clocks she could not return, the ones whose owners were deceased with no traceable family, the ones whose address records led nowhere, stayed in the blasting room, which was no longer sealed. She had the shelving cleaned and the room properly aired, and she left the clocks where Walter had put them, because they were already arranged in the way that Walter had arranged things, which was with care. She put a card on the door, written in her own hand, Walter's collection. She left the door open. Graham came on Tuesday afternoons. He brought his tools and his knowledge and the particular satisfaction of a man doing the work he is best at with someone who wants to learn it properly, and he taught her, slowly, systematically, in the way that good teaching always happens, how to dismantle and clean and regulate a mechanical movement, how to identify what had stopped and why, how to return something to itself. She was good at it. She had her father's joiner's hands, patient with small things, and she had the quality of finding the particular problem interesting rather than frustrating, which Graham said was the most important thing, more important than the knowledge, which could be learned. The quality could not. She put a sign in the outer room window, clock repair. Inquire within. First consultation free. There was a jar on the sill below it. People came. Villagers first, then people from Stonelow and Matlock and further out who had heard from someone who had heard. She fixed what she could and told them honestly what she couldn't, and she charged for parts and consumables and left the rest to the jar. The jar filled reliably enough. Not wealth, but sufficiency. And sufficiency was what she had come with, and was what she had learned to value without embarrassment. She slept in the building, in the outer room, on a proper bed she had bought from the charity shop in Matlock in December. She had insulated the windows with the secondary glazing film from the hardware shop, and she had the range going every day, and the building was, in the Derbyshire way of old stone buildings, far warmer than it looked. In February, she applied for planning permission to convert the upper story to a small flat, which was granted in 6 months, and she spent the summer after that doing the conversion herself and with her father's tools, which she had kept in the Astra boot since Tideswell, and which she had always been going to use for something. Walter Croft had fixed things in this building for 25 years, because things that stop are not the same as things that are finished, and because he believed, and had put this down in his notebook for whoever came after, that everything that stops can be started again. He had proved this, 214 times, with patience and a small workshop, and the specific knowledge that what seems irreparable usually is not. He had sealed the room because he had not known what else to do with what he had made, and because he had trusted time to send someone who would. She was 20 years old when she was sleeping in the back seat of a Vauxhall Astra with her knees angled and her brother's number going to voicemail. £10 and one key and a welded steel door and a room full of stopped clocks, every one of them repaired and waiting. The first one she wound, by herself, on the evening Pete Sowerby left, before she knew any of this, before the notebook, before Susan Barlow, before Graham, was a small carriage clock from the shelf nearest the door. Not one with a name on the tag, one of the returned ones, brought back by someone who had moved or changed their mind. Its tag reading only returned. No name, no story, just the fact of it being here. She found the winding square on the back of the movement and used the small key that Walter had left in the case, and she wound it slowly. Feeling the mainspring take the tension ratchet by ratchet, and when she felt the resistance that meant it was fully wound, she set the balance wheel moving with the tip of her finger, and she listened. The tick established itself in the cold stone room, the way a sound does when it has been waiting a long time to be heard, tentatively at first, finding its own rhythm, and then with the particular steadiness of a mechanical thing doing what it was made to do. The same interval, the same clarity, the same tick as it had made for whoever had owned it before this, and before that, however many years back the chain ran. She sat on the workbench and listened to it for a while. Then she went to sleep in the outer room, in her sleeping bag on the flagstone floor, and the clock ticked through the wall all night, steady and patient and entirely itself. Everything that stops can be started again. Walter had proved this 214 times. She was beginning to understand how. If this story found you when you needed it, I hope you'll share it with someone, and please subscribe if you haven't already. Leave me a comment. Has something in your life stopped that you've since found a way to start again? I read every word. Thank you for being here. I'll see you in the next one.